You are live.
Okay, so dear all, thank you very much, and you're all welcome to the MED virtual panel. So today we will actually discuss about how the current protests that took place in the region actually have been affected by the COVID emergency. In the last months, there was quite a wave of protests going on in many parts of the Middle East, especially in Algeria, in Lebanon, in Iraq, and partially in Iran and other countries. And some have even spoke about the second wave of the Arab Spring, and that's quite an interesting and problematic concept because on the one hand, of course, we see people in the street, people of different background, people having different viewpoint, taking the street and asking to get a change. And there was middle class, there was working class, there were people with different background. But on the other, we also saw some differences. For example, we saw that the square were asking more concrete and in a way pragmatic changes, for example, the electoral law in Lebanon or the end of some aspect of the current system in Iraq. And also we have seen some people claiming to stop having interference from external players, which was something that was not as much of a big issue during the 2011 protest time. And of course, we also have seen that some of the people who took the street actually were facing a different type of elite, because in 2011, we all kind of have these military regimes. We had all these people who were mostly nationalist, linked with the army and so on, while now we see that the protest has been targeted different type of elite. We have different parties in power with different political orientation, and the square which ask for change to this new kind of political class. So before to start, a few points. The first one is that, of course, this initiative is within the year-long MED initiative that will end next autumn and will host different events. So, of course, if you are interested and if you think it's you want to have more insight, there are really a lot of interesting events going on. So just keep up following us. And the second element, which is important, is that we will discuss for around 40 minutes. So the last 20 minutes will open the floor for questions, whoever is interested to ask about our host a bit more. So you can write the question in the Q&A, and then we will just select some and we will ask the host. You can also indicate if you want to ask specifically to Mr. Al-Aldin or Ms. Khatib a specific question. And at the end, there will be also a small poll, and this is another thing. Before to introduce the host, is also, I think it's important to remember that we have seen in these days with the death of Hashimi how difficult it is in some situation to take the square and say their opinion to the people. So this is also an element I would like to stress, that we are doing it a few days after this very sad event which took place in Iraq, and which stress even more how important it is to speak about activism and how we sometimes things do not change, but actually there is a change going on in many parts of the region. So I introduce the two hosts, and then I'll ask them questions. So the first one is Lina Khatib, who is director of the Middle East and North Africa program at the Chatham House, UK. Ranj Al-Aldin, who is visiting fellow at the Brookings Doha Center, Qatar, and the director of the Proxy War Initiative at the Carnegie Corporation of New York. So I'll start with Ms. Khatib, and the question is actually the same for both, by asking how is the state of the art of the protest and how COVID actually affected people taking the street and people protesting against the government. So the floor is yours, Ms. Khatib.
Okay, well, thank you very much for hosting me and for holding this very timely event. Of course, when the COVID crisis began, everybody's attention really was mainly directed to the public health dimension of the crisis. And we saw the people who had been filling up the squares in places like Beirut and Baghdad decrease in numbers. But that doesn't mean that the protests themselves died down because of the COVID crisis. If anything, the crisis has only added to the list of problems that these people were protesting against. In Lebanon, for example, the economic situation became worse as a result of the COVID crisis. I mean, it was already really bad, but it became worse because people had to stay home, which meant that those relying on daily labor couldn't make a living. And the state had no social protection measures that were adequate that it could offer them. So if anything, the COVID crisis highlighted the same issues that people had been protesting about before, which is the lack of responsiveness from the state to the citizens. But also, if you dig deeper, you'll see that the root cause of this is the political status quo in these countries, which is the main reason why there are these no social protection mechanisms that are adequate in the first place. So basically, the protesters were already telling us before COVID that it is the political system that is the problem, and that the economic and other social repercussions are simply the outcome of the political status quo. So what's happening now that the COVID crisis has mainly eased off in a lot of places in the region is that we are seeing numbers in the streets grow again. Maybe not to the same degree as before, but we shouldn't, and I emphasize this, judge protest movements by the numbers of people on the street. The issues are ongoing and people's grievances have actually increased.
So thank you very much. I would like to ask the same questions to Mr. Al-Aldin.
Well, thanks very much, Matteo, and huge thanks to Ispi and Chiara for putting this timely discussion together. As you highlighted, it's been made all the more timely because of the cowardly assassination of Hisham al-Hashimi in Iraq. And I think the incident itself has really highlighted, symbolizes, in fact, the magnitude of the task that faces protesters across the region. Let me start off by sort of alluding to what Lina has already pointed out, and that is effectively that what we're seeing today, what we've seen over the past year with these protests, is a culmination of immense anger, discontent, poverty, economic dislocation, which has persisted over the past decade, certainly. And COVID-19 has effectively added to that long list of challenges that faces multiple countries in the region. So one has to always point out, I would say, is that although COVID-19 requires its own containment strategy, a cogent, viable strategy, it is also something which is enabled and exacerbated by challenges like the lack of good governance, lack of inclusive governance, the lack of accountability, and of course, the lack of inclusivity in the multiple economies of the region. But I would say at the same time that COVID-19 has provided something of an opportunity. It's true that different governments, regimes, leaders have weaponized the crisis to extend and expand their control over the political sphere, over society itself. But in a way, I would say it's exposed the vulnerabilities and the fragility of political systems. It's exposed, of course, the neglect that public healthcare systems have faced over many years. And in a way, I would say that reinforces or empowers the hand of protesters moving forward. Because if there's anything protesters need, it's that ability to expand or enhance their capacity to mobilize and to contest in very difficult circumstances. So by shining a light on COVID, what you're effectively doing is shining a light on precisely those challenges that I've outlined when it comes to governance, when it comes to the economy, when it comes to providing livelihoods for people. But also protest movements generally tend to be comprised of disparate groups, different entities, actors. It can sometimes be fluid. But in fact, COVID-19 has actually reinforced that nexus, that bond between these groups. And what that means is you've got an added layer to an organization, to a movement rather, that will face profound challenges moving forward. It's true that governments in the region have and will continue to repress by way of violence, intimidation. But the scholarly literature, the studies from around the world show that although protest movements might be suppressed, whether that's through violence, through intimidation, or whether that's through something like a pandemic, they still retain a very marked capacity to remobilize, to revive themselves. So I think the story that we're looking at is an ongoing one. Perhaps the most important, I think, element which is understated in the discussion and the debates is the economic dimension, because although we do normally focus much more on security, on violence against protesters, on the crackdown against civil society, for example, the economic implications that COVID-19 will have for societies as a whole, I think will be very far-reaching. And when you've got the sort of poverty numbers that are being projected by the UN, for example, which estimates 52 million people in the region will be malnourished, which estimates around 100 to 130 million will become impoverished. What you're really talking about is enablers of further unrest, enablers of militancy, and enablers of terrorism.
Thank you very much, Mr. Al-Aldin. So we've spoken about how the current protests have been affected in a way or in another by COVID. And the government will also be affected, as you say, and I want to go back to this point later. But I will start again with Ms. Khatib. How do you see in the future, what will happen next? Of course, we are now in an emergency situation, but at one point the street will reopen, people will be able to at least organize some sort of protest. And I would like to ask you, how do you think it will go on in the future with the focus on Lebanon? Because of course, Lebanon has its peculiar situation. And if something, all countries have their peculiar situation, of course there are similarities, but there are also specificity. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, Lebanon is tragic and complicated at once. In previous rounds of protests that the country saw, for example, in 2015, the international community was paying more attention to Lebanon than it is today. And at the time, there was still a relationship going on between Arab Gulf countries and Lebanon, in the sense that some sort of engagement, whether trade, whether aid, was still happening at the time. This has now significantly shifted. When it comes to the international community at large, the West in particular does not see Lebanon as a priority. For the United States, here I've emphasized that the United States remains, whether we like it or not, the trendsetter in terms of Western engagement with Lebanon. The United States, to me, looks like it's looking at Lebanon as a subcomponent of the bigger Iran picture in the region. And the maximum pressure strategy that the United States is taking towards Iran is definitely affecting Lebanon as well as Syria. And of course, Lebanon and Syria are becoming increasingly intertwined in terms of the economic devastation happening in both countries. So Lebanon is no longer able to say the West is going to have a distinct Lebanon policy that is very much tailored to its problems, when the US priority is to exert maximum pressure on Iran and is feeling, at least this current administration, that that pressure is working. That means there is no incentive for US allies like Arab Gulf countries to run to the rescue of Lebanon at this moment, when they share the same concerns about Iran that the US has. So the Lebanese people are basically on their own. They are there on the streets, or even if they are at home, expressing their grievances in private. They are facing the status quo in Lebanon, and this status quo is operating in a way that, to me, feels like they don't want the Lebanese people to exist, full stop. They are basically the reverse of the formula of the people demand the fall of the regime. Someone created a piece of graffiti in Lebanon that basically said, the regime demands the fall of the people. And so what I'm saying here is that the situation in Lebanon is no longer about being able to look for rescue from the West. It's very domestic, and the domestic situation has seen a complete breakdown in the social contract. Even the patron-client relationships that used to, in a way, sometimes be used to calm people down in Lebanon when it comes to the political status quo and how it dealt with protests, that is changing as well. So there's a lot of changes going on because, as I said, external forces aren't going to do much. The status quo is clinging onto power, pretending the people don't exist, but at the same time, no longer delivering even to their own clients in the same way as before. And that's largely because the political class in Lebanon, that happens to also be the economic elites, are also not able anymore to deliver to their own clients. So we're seeing fundamental shifts. Now, some of these shifts are positive because, to me, the breakdown in patron-client relationships is a huge step forward for Lebanon because it is what has kept the sectarian clientelistic system of power in place for decades. So this is the first step. But what we can see is that to dismantle this system, we are unfortunately going to be experiencing a long period of pain in Lebanon first. And this is now only the beginning, I'm afraid. So I think what we're going to see next is increasing social and economic grievances in Lebanon. We are going to see a political elite clinging on to power and ignoring the Lebanese citizens at large. These citizens' grievances are only going to get worse. There's not going to be any rescue from outside. As we know, the only potential rescue came in the form of some discussion with the IMF. And the IMF saw very clearly that the political class in Lebanon right now is not serious about implementing any reforms that would make Lebanon eligible for IMF support. So what I'm seeing is Lebanon heading even closer than before to a failed state scenario in which there is no rule of law, in which there is no state that is responsive to its citizens, even cosmetically, with a political class that maybe we'll see some changes in the cabinet in Lebanon, perhaps, but sadly, an entrenchment of those in power. And I don't think the situation is going to change for the short term at all. It's just going to get worse.
Thank you, Ms. Khatib. I would like to zoom in now on Iraq with Mr. Al-Aldin. So what do you think will happen in the future? And you know, we have some similarities and differences with Lebanon. So can you elaborate on that and tell us what will happen in your opinion?
Sure. Well, I think Lena could have, just as easily been talking about Iraq, to be frank, and to put it plainly. But I think Iraq deserves its own category. It's a country that, true, has been engulfed in protests, political instability in recent months, the past year. But it's also a country that has been engulfed in at least, 2 civil wars, immense sectarian conflict, the threat from ISIS, and added to that is the economic implications of the decline in oil prices. So it's a whole plethora, multitude of challenges that the country has had to face in a very short period of time, one could say. And of course, you've got to now add the pandemic to that list. The protest movement in Iraq has shown remarkable resiliency. In large part, I think, one could point towards the violence, the brutal suppression that the protesters had to face under the previous government. And I emphasize the word resiliency here because there are times where, for example, the protest movement might be on the way because of the pandemic, because of the violence. But at the same time, it's shown a very remarkable capacity in response to political incidents, in response to intimidation at times. And I think moving forward, it all comes down to how this current government performs. Right now, I think the government is in a much better position compared to the previous one. There is a sense within the Iraqi society that this government should be given a chance to prove itself. So there is some breathing space right now. Now, that small window of opportunity for the government to actually capitalize on the momentum that has emerged since it was formed 2 months ago will continue to narrow, will continue to close. And it isn't helped when you've got things like the assassination of important, very critical voices of reform, of reason, like Hisham al-Hashmi, because all that really does, it triggers precisely the environment that is not conducive to reform, conducive to short and medium-term measures that can produce an economy that can provide for Iraqis, that can give Iraqis effectively a stake in the future of their country. And this is all in a way by design, because there are actors in Iraq that want to torpedo the reform process, that want to torpedo the current government's efforts to diversify the economy, to use a culture of entrepreneurialism, and generally address the economic drivers of youth discontent. So I think it's particularly important for the support of the international community here to make sure it doesn't fall for the bait, because my fear is you will have additional incidents like the of Hisham al-Hashmi, designed precisely to undermine the current government, to trigger another round of instability. And I think it's important to not fall for the bait there, because that's precisely what the spoilers want. That's precisely what the militia groups in Iraq want. It's a very difficult balancing act that has to be played here, because on one hand, you've got the expectations of the Iraqi public, and then you've got what's actually feasible in the political and economic environment. So a huge part of the challenge will be to continue the outreach efforts. The government's done a good job of reaching out to protesters, move to the movement overall, but it's going to continue for additional chinks in its armor as a result of the spoilers, the so-called not just militia groups, by the way. There are very powerful actors who have a very vested interest in maintaining the current status quo. So, I don't really envy the position that the current prime minister is in, but at the same time, despite what's happened over the past week, there is still a glimmer of hope under the current prime minister and the reform measures being proposed by him, by the deputy prime minister in particular, could perhaps inject a momentum in the system overall, and ultimately ensure the spoilers, although they'll continue to poke holes in the current environment and try to derail the government and its reform process, by and large, there is still a large section of the Iraqi society, and dare I say, within the Iraqi political class itself, that is determined to move the country away from the abyss.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Yeah, so it's something we already spoke in your intervention, but I want to zoom in, because the current crisis we are facing now is not just about an emergency from a health emergency, but it's of course also a financial emergency. We see it very well in Europe, by the way. So it's not just in the Middle East; it's more of a global situation. So you already spoke about, of course, the demand of the square, but also how the government can cope with that. Of course, what the government normally do is they try to accept some of the requests of the square without changing big things. So we saw, for example, they replaced some government, they replaced some minister, and so on. But more or less, the people in power are more or less the same in most of the cases, I would say. So I would like to ask to Lina Khatib, how does she think the current situation in terms of financial possibility for a state who are not having income from oil, so mostly Lebanon, in a way also Sudan, which is the transition going on, will affect the possibility of the government to give partially what the square wants, or to cope with the square by not giving them anything, but utilizing patronage, links, and so on?
Well, unfortunately, when it comes to Lebanon, we can see within the government competition between, for example, the cabinet and the central bank over how bad the economic situation actually is. So the government says the situation is bad, and then the central bank comes back and says, actually, it's not as bad as the cabinet says. So when you see this tug of war within state institutions and among state institutions, this does not inspire confidence, neither for the Lebanese citizens who are watching what the state is doing and its institutions and also the rulers, nor for the external actors like the IMF or any other external actor who might want to give Lebanon some sort of economic support package. So unfortunately, when it comes to the government's ability to deliver, not only do we have a bankrupt state in Lebanon, but we also have a state completely lacking in transparency, which is going to make the situation worse and not be able to deliver what is needed.
Thank you very much. I would like to ask to Rajal Aldin specifically with oil producing country, because there you have a double problem. You have the economic crisis, and you have the price of oil going quite up and down, I would say mostly down in the last month. And that would be an issue for countries who have to pay, for example, public worker with this money. So how do you think the government will be able to respond specifically with countries which depends for large part of the export on the oil?
Well, I think you really on the head there. I think Iraq is still dependent on oil for its revenue. Estimates range from around 90 to 95% of its budget actually depend on oil. The decline in oil prices, I think the Iraqi political system will be temporary. But with the current prime minister and deputy prime minister, you've got an added sense of urgency to diversifying the economy. But I was keen to highlight the issue of expectations, precisely because we're talking about standing structural challenge. Sector itself, I think, is the single most important issue facing Iraq itself. And I don't think until Iraq reforms its public sector, it can actually address dependency on oil to provide livelihoods, pay salaries, and so forth. Ultimately, if we're talking about the protest movement, we're talking about the youth here, and we're talking about the economic drivers of youth discontent. And that means diversify the economy so that it enables people to be able to secure jobs faced with a serious, something as simple as running a business. Can cost you.
I think there is a problem with the connection, so perhaps we can try to go back in 2 minutes, and you can start from this point. I would just go on 1 second with Ms. Khatib, and then we will return to that. Otherwise, it's a bit difficult to understand. So, yeah, we were speaking about the capability of a government to respond to that, and I was actually curious to ask you this: what do you think? You can also zoom in all of the countries would be an acceptable demand for the majority of the square. Of course, you want a radical change in some sector, but might be that some sector would be fine having a more limited change. So what do you think the square would be? Okay, that's enough. We can go back to our normal life.
When it comes to Lebanon in particular, what people are looking for now is maintaining livelihood. Unfortunately, the bar is that low right now. I mean, it's estimated that between 60 and 70% of the Lebanese population is now below the poverty line, largely as a result of the collapse of the Lebanese currency. So I think just stabilizing the currency alone would go a long way to at least letting people know how to manage their affairs, because right now there are something like 5 different exchange rates in Lebanon that change every single day. And so people cannot plan. They don't know what they can afford. They don't know what they actually have in terms of its own worth. And of course, the situation economically is completely frozen as a result. Who's gonna want to come and invest in Lebanon under the circumstances? Who's gonna want to put their money in Lebanese banks under the circumstances? So Lebanon is also losing huge components of its own economy. Things that used to be taken for granted, like even remittances from the diaspora, are being affected now because people cannot cash these remittances in US dollars if they are sent to most banks or through cash transfer companies. So we're seeing a fundamental change, and any government policy that at least addresses these issues, I think, is going to calm the situation down a little bit. But that's not going to end the protest. It's not going to result in people saying, okay, now we're satisfied. It's just going to enable people to just have a living and perhaps prevent the country from descending into some sort of criminal chaos, which I seriously worry about. Because when people are poor and they don't see a way out, it's going to be attractive to be able to, for example, stop someone and rob them in broad daylight, which is something that happened on the streets of Beirut just last week, for instance. I mean, right now, these incidents are quite isolated, but we are seeing more visibility for them. And we are seeing more incentives for people to basically lose hope. So I think a government policy dedicated to securing livelihoods would be a huge step forward.
Okay. Thank you very much. So I would like to go back to Mr. Al-Aldin. So we were discussing about the government relying on the revenues, because in that case it's a double problem. So we heard the beginning of your answers, and you were saying that they will have issues, of course, with public spending and the public wages. So I just would like to go back to that, because we had some problem, of course, hearing you. So if you can just go on the same topic.
Of course. Sorry about the connection. At the risk of repeating myself, I mean, just to sort of echo what Lina has said in a way. There's really two parts to this challenge. One is the expectation on the part of the public, and secondly, what's actually possible in the short and medium term. Since we're talking about addressing structural challenges, it could be, if not generations, until some of the addressed. But I think as a starting point, it's the culture here that needs to be shifted. Every Iraqi considers it a right as they've graduated, and we're talking about 700,000 graduates per year. So the perception itself needs to be changed, and that can take some time, but it does come down to the communication strategy that you have in place for this. Secondly, I think the government and the state rather is its own worst enemy by making it so difficult for young people to set up their own business. I'm not sure if you caught this earlier in my intervention, but I was highlighting how arduous and painstaking it is to actually set up your own business or to register a business. So what takes us in the West no longer than 10, 15 minutes can cost thousands of pounds and weeks, if not months, in Iraq. You've got to hire a lawyer and so forth. I think the system itself would be a good place to start to enable that culture, which is entrepreneurialism, that encourages the growth of a private sector. And these can be the building blocks for more difficult long-term challenges, building blocks for the more long-term structural policies that the to implement. Now, it isn't helped when you've got a unstable political environment, because what the current government is effectively a transitional one. There are expectations that the country will hold another round of elections in 2 years. So it's going to be very difficult, I wouldn't say insurmountable, but very difficult to implement those measures that can achieve some of the objectives that I've outlined. But I think it's moving in the right direction, the conduct of spoilers notwithstanding.
Thank you very much. I also would like to ask you the same question I asked to Ms. Khatib. What do you think would be enough for the square in Iraq? What do you think would be a reasonable outcome for the majority of people in the square?
Well, I think, on the surface, it can sometimes seem like protesters have very ambitious, unrealistic objectives. So although we hear slogans which call for regime political system, their slogans. The Iraqi public, the youth, stupid. They know that a lot of the need to be implemented can take a while. But although they don't always expect immediate results, what they do expect from the political class is to not have their intelligence insulted. But most importantly, I think it comes down to the A word, and that's accountability. If a politician, if a party, if a government is underachieving, or if it's incapable of delivering its promises, incapable of delivering good governance, then people need to be held to account. And I think that's what Iraqis are really striving for at the moment. In a way, they've actually achieved it themselves, because as a result, a direct result of the protest movement, the previous government was effectively ousted and replaced with the current one. As a result of the protest movement, you've had provincial council members, you've had governors, you've had other decision makers and influence come under increased scrutiny. So although these officials may have once been comfortable in their positions, the protest movement on its own has gone a very long way in fostering that culture of accountability, that environment of accountability. And I think that, again, is perhaps a step in the right direction. And if there was some alignment between what the protesters want vis-a-vis accountability and what the government can do, then I think you have a very good and strong symbiosis between the two actways, the society and the state.
Thank you very much. We opened a little bit before the discussion because I saw there are already some questions. So the first question is to Professor Sorina Khatib. Besides Hezbollah, how much responsibility have the other political forces in the current government in Lebanon? That's the question for you.
It's a good question. And the answer is the slogan that people have used on the street is in Arabic, Killun yani Killun, which is all of them means all of them. And that's the answer to the question. Everybody in the current political class in Lebanon is responsible for the crisis that Lebanon is in. And this crisis is not something that happened overnight. It's the result of a political system that has been in place for decades. And what we're seeing really is this political system and its implications grow over the decades as a snowball, with everyone being part of it and contributing to it as a component, even if these different political entities may be competing with one another. We saw an illustration of this in Lebanon in 2015 when protests started, sparked by concerns about lack of rubbish collection. And at the time, the politicians who were arguing one another just before the protest started suddenly got together and teamed up against the street, against the protesters, because they saw in it a threat to the status quo. And this is exactly what is happening in Lebanon today, although playing out in a bit of a different way. For example, the Future Movement led by Saad Hariri and also the Lebanese forces withdrew from the cabinet. The Lebanese forces withdrew from the previous cabinet in October, and then Hariri, who was prime minister, resigned, causing the cabinet to fall. They did not do this really because they were so concerned about answering citizen demands, as much as they did it because they felt that this is how they could get political currency for themselves, so they could make a comeback later on. So Lebanon keeps seeing the same recycled faces again and again. And so everyone is responsible. Of course, some people right now are playing a more destructive role than others. And of course, Hezbollah, I would put it at the top along with its partners, the Free Patriotic Movement, because it is largely due to them that Lebanon is so negatively affected by US sanctions about terrorism financing and money laundering, for example. it is largely due to them that the crisis in Syria has exacerbated, which has resulted in catastrophe, human, political, and economic in Syria as well as in Lebanon. It is also them who are in power today, because the Lebanese cabinet currently in charge may not officially be a Hezbollah-run cabinet, but in practice it is a Hezbollah-run cabinet. So they have a lot of responsibility for what is happening. And what is really outrageous is speeches like the one given by the leader of Hezbollah a couple of days ago, Hassan Nasrallah, in which he calls upon the Lebanese people to engage in agriculture and industry to lift themselves out of the crisis, forgetting that his own ministers were in charge of ministries like the Ministry of Agriculture in previous cabinets and did not really do anything. So there is a lot of hypocrisy expressed by all political sides in this conflict. We're seeing this game of ping pong with all political parties blaming one another for the crisis, when the reality is they're all responsible.
Thank you very much. There is also a question from Mr. Aladdin. So the question is, among Al-Khadim promises to square, there was the explicit assignment to persecute those who committed abuse and killings against protesters. Is there any possibility that that will happen in the upcoming future, in your opinion?
I think that's an excellent question, an issue that I've highlighted in my remarks. To be honest, I think it's unlikely. It really depends on which, as we're talking about here. The violence against protesters is currently a process underway to identify, hold to account those individuals who are responsible. But the problem here is this is politics. We're talking, like other places, is politics. And if we're talking about individual culpability and individual accountability, if those individuals are part of or are empowered by powerful political actors, blocs, then it's very difficult to hold them to account. Now, that said, you can always start somewhere. And I think that's going to be the tricky of the prime minister. You don't have to go to the highest level of the decision-making system in the country to achieve accountability. You can always start with the low-hanging fruit, so to speak, and then gradually you can move from there. But it does come down to how politically confident the current prime minister is. This is a coalition government you've got in Iraq. The Iraqi parliament is dominated by those actors that have been directly complicit in the suppression of the protesters. Iran-aligned groups in particular have had a hand in violently suppressing the protesters, but they have significant, substantial sway within the Iraqi parliament over state institutions. So to answer their question, I think in the short term, it's very unlikely. But I'm confident in a way that the current prime minister, the current government can perhaps potentially establish the building blocks that allows them to go after those actors, those individuals, and ultimately those parties that are responsible for the atrocities against the protesters.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's of course a very difficult situation in Iraq, and this is one of the main issues that definitely should be addressed. There are other two questions. I think we can have it for both. We can start with Ms. Khatib and then we can go with Mr. Aladdin. So it's a bit of a general question. So regarding the reaction of government and political authorities, COVID-19 has prompted an increase, of course, in surveillance and social control measures. What are, in your opinion, the implications on the government strategy toward the protesters? I think it's quite a general question, so you can answer the way you want, focusing on the example you think is better. So we can start with Ms. Khatib.
Thank you. Well, once again, we are seeing the government in Lebanon not only not respond, but also crack down with violence and increased surveillance measures when it comes to not just protest, but any expression of dissent, which is new in Lebanon. Lebanon, in relative terms, when it comes to where it stands compared to its peers in the Arab world, usually used to be on the lighter side when it comes to censorship and oppression of this kind. But it is now moving to what a lot of people in Lebanon are referring to a Ba'ath-like regime of dealing with dissent. People are being arrested or harassed if they express criticisms of the government. This is something that had happened in Lebanon before, but is now happening more frequently and at a higher level than before. So we are seeing, for example, quite well-known public figures being targeted. So definitely surveillance is a method that the government is using more so than physical violence in Lebanon as a way to control public opinion and public expressions, and also try to send a lesson to those who might want to speak out, to say, you know, if you speak out, look what can happen to you, and no one is untouchable, because even these popular figures like journalists, etc., are being targeted and sometimes accused of treason, etc. This is a very disturbing development in Lebanon, because, as I said, it marks a stark contrast to how the state used to conduct its affairs. In the past, there used to be at least a bit of a margin for freedom of expression, and that margin is narrowing down.
Thank you. I'll ask the same question to Mr. Al-Aldin.
Well, I think in a way, like I said in my remarks, the Iraqi government has been gifted with something of a reset vis-a-vis its relationship with the protesters. What was really lacking under the previous government during the protests in particular was, I would say, the complete absence of dialogue between the government and the protest movement, because since Prime Minister Kadhimi came into office, one of his first measures, his first response to the protest movement was to actually reach out to them and devise groups within his office itself, within the government, to actually work more closely with the protest movement. Because there's 2 or 3 parts to this. It's ultimately about identifying the grievances of the protesters, and then you can use that as a starting point to develop, let's say, a stronger nexus with the movement. If you're a government that is unable to meet those expectations, to address those grievances in the short term, protesters need to know why. There has to be a level of respect here that I think ultimately is required to underscore a stable relationship between the society and the state or government. So I think we still have to wait maybe a number of months, especially with with summer now upon us, a number of months until we can assess how good of a job Prime Minister Kadhimi and the government has done in that respect. But the signaling, what's been projected from the government so far has been encouraging. But coming back to the very first point that I made in my remarks, Iraq is still mired in a whole range of problems, some that it can actually deal with itself and has itself to blame with, but a lot of it is also externally driven and induced. So, Iraq could very quickly, over the coming weeks, become engulfed in another round of US-Iran tensions, which could translate into violent conflict on its territory. So I think that makes the whole situation rather precarious for the government. But at the same time, I think adds a bit of urgency to the whole to its response to the protest movement and to the broader problems facing the country at large. In the long term, you need a revised social contract, which can engineer a more stable political environment, a more stable social environment, and ultimately meet the expectations of the population and address many of the socio-economic grievances that has underpinned the protest movement. So in short, I think we need to wait a bit longer before we can truly assess how well this government is doing and how well it might be doing in the future.
Thank you very much. Actually, in your answer, you're pointing to something that has been mentioned in the last 2 questions I would like to ask you both. which is the geopolitical dimension of that. Is the fact that these protests do not happen in a vacuum, but they happen in a region where there are shifting alliances and there is a change in the balance of power, we could say. So one of the questions we get, which I think it's quite interesting to go deeper into this issue, it's from Stephen Sparrow, who asked, could the protests trigger a complete change of alliances from the Lebanese and Iraqi government toward the West, as Iran is the main factor of political impasse now, which is interesting because was a regime was saying we are exporting our revolution, we are revolutionary, but now from the eyes of the protesters, probably they are the main factor of the status quo. So we can start with Ms. Khatib about it, and then we go with Mr. Al-Aldin.
Well, one can hope that protests can eventually lead to a regional shift in the balance of power, not just domestic progress, but also progress when it comes to external meddling. I am not sure about progress, but one thing is for sure. Iran's engagement across the Arab world is overextending what Iran is able to do in a way that is strategic. In the past, we used to kind of be a bit more confident about Iran having a strategy for exporting the revolution or extending its influence. But I think the economic situation in Lebanon right now, which happened despite Hezbollah being in charge behind the scenes in the country for a while, shows that Hezbollah and by extension Iran do not have an economic vision, do not have an economic strategy. If anything, it is highlighting the shortcomings of this expansion and this engagement. It's an engagement that's primarily based on security lenses through which they approach the political landscape and even the economic landscape. And this is not adequate. It's not adequate for keeping this engagement alive in the long term. I mean, yes, it's been 40 years and that is long enough. However, it is not forever. I predict that this is now the beginning of a significant shift in Iran's ability to juggle all those components in the region as a whole. But the problem is, this is not going to be something that's gonna result in the end of Iranian influence overnight. It's not going to happen without a huge price paid by especially local populations in these areas. And so, you know, I am the first to criticize Iran's role in the region, but I am going to also not celebrate the way the Iranian influence is right now being challenged by all these issues, just because of the significant devastating impact all this is happening on people in the region as a whole, and in particular in places like Syria and Lebanon, but also beyond that. Also, I would include Iraq and Yemen and elsewhere.
Mr. Aldin, of course, Iraq, it's a place where Iran had played a role. So do you agree with the interpretation of Ms. Khatib, or you are some point of disagreement?
No, I think I largely agree with what Lina has said. You know, Iraq, I think, is, dare I say, you know, where the fate of the Islamic Republic could be decided. It's a country that Iran has invested very heavily in, expended immense resources, bloodshed, and it won't give up the keys to the gates of Baghdad very easily. And you know, what we see unfolding in Iraq, what we've seen unfold over the past few days, they're all symptoms really of this long-standing, let's say, contest between Iran and its rivals, the US in particular, to shape the political order of the so-called post-2003 Iraq. But we're now in a post-October era where the current government finds itself in a situation where it has to balance Iraq's relationship with the US and Iran. Iran has suffered a whole series of chinks in its armor. It's been undermined by a protest movement that blames it for its role in suppressing civilians, in carrying out atrocities against civilians. Iran has been lamented very vocally by the protesters since October as a result of its influence in the country, the dominance of its proxies, its militia groups. And if there were elections in Iraq tomorrow, the first casualty of those elections would be Iran-aligned parties and movements. And I think in a way, this sort of reinforces the earlier point I made on the magnitude of the task facing Prime Minister Kadhimi, because the expectation is that Iraq will have elections at some point. But if a country like Iran and its very powerful allies in Iraq well and perfectly understand that this will ultimately result in their decline in the country, it's extremely unlikely, if not impossible, that those elections will be held. But I think it ultimately comes down to the politics here. The protest movement in Iraq has, in my opinion, now become a political movement that can actually contest elections as an entity, or one that empowers existing political parties. So in a way, I think what we've seen is this very marked transformation of what was a series of disparate protesters come together to establish a movement that can now shape the political landscape in the country. And I think that's what Iran truly fears. Now, what we're going to see is possibly over the coming months is precisely an increase in the sort of assassinations that we saw unfold a few days ago to torpedo the stability of the Iraqi political environment, to torpedo the government's attempts to balance relations with the US and Iran, and ultimately impede the reform process. Because when it comes to the reform process, again, the first casualty will be Iran and its allies. So these are very dangerous, uncertain times for Iran. But like Lena pointed out, it's not going to give up what it's achieved. It's not going to give up its rather remarkable achievements without a very firm fight. And I think, again, that does not bode well for a country like Iraq that is trying to turn a new chapter, post the defeat of ISIS, and of course, post the assassination of Qasem Soleimani.
Yeah, thank you very much. There is a last question, then we see if we have time for another one, but I think we are going toward the end, which kind of relinks to the possibility of calling, of course, second Arab Spring or wave of Arab Spring, because in 2011, of course, there was quite an attention about the social network and technology. So Lorenzo Rigli asked how are technology and social networks shaping protests in Lebanon and Iraq, and if you want, also elsewhere. And I would add also how the reaction of the government, how the government is using it eventually to repress and disrupt the protests. So we can start with Lena again.
Okay, thank you. I mean, first, I don't know which second wave might happen first, second wave of COVID or second wave of Arab Spring. But on a more serious note, for me, the Arab Spring is not something that happened and is over. It's actually a continuous process. And when we look at social media and the use of technology today, it's also a continuous process. People always use the available technology of the day. And people right now are using the more sophisticated technologies that weren't available 10 years ago to connect with one another. And this is positive. But at the same time, governments are doing the same. They have also upped their game in terms of surveillance. In Lebanon, for example, we are seeing Facebook accounts being monitored by the intelligence services, for example, and people basically feeling that they are under surveillance online in a way that was not experienced 10 years ago in the country. What gives me hope, as I always say, is that the protesters and the citizens are always that one step ahead when it comes to innovation, when it comes to mobilization, and governments usually have to play catch up. So I think this is likely to continue.
And the question is the same. So how do you see continuity and differences? Also, how do you see the government and protesters using social media, and how is it shaping it, the protest?
Sure. Well, I think any emphasis on the Arab Spring in a way sort of simplifies the problem. It's easy to characterize every protest, major upheaval, as being an extension of the Arab Spring. But I think we're now at a point where we all need to start looking at protests within local contexts. rather than through very broad strokes. And if there's anything we can learn from the protest movements in the region, in a country like Iraq in particular, is that they will not be going away. If countless governments, regimes over the years, over many decades, have attempted to silence protesters through coercion, intimidation, by buying them off. And I don't really see the use of technology being a game changer. If anything, it's been a very useful enabler of protests, of the protest movements. It's allowed for more coordination between disparate groups within the movement. Now, that isn't to say that it can't be used and weaponized to their disadvantage, but I'm a big believer in the resiliency of protest movements to adapt to the challenges of the day. If anything in Iraq, in fact, the government itself needs to embrace technology a bit more, because although you've got the protest movement utilizing technology very effectively, perhaps one other actor that is using it with great impact and effect in a very negative sense is the militias, is the informal authorities, is the Iran-aligned groups who have a very impressive capability when it comes to their projection of propaganda, when it comes to having very effective messaging campaigns. So in a way, I think you need a more, let's say, proactive role from the Iraqi government to effectively level out the playing field in a way, and ultimately use that as a stepping stone to improve its symbiosis with the protest movement. So I wouldn't say technology is a game changer per se, but it is something that can be used either way, either to weaponize or to empower.
Yeah, I actually totally agree with that. That we often kind of don't give. We think like it's something that it's different in other countries, but we're all using it, and of course can be used in different way. And it's at the end a means. So of course it can help for a protest without a leader. But again, I think there are some disclaimers to make there. And I also think I agree that there is a very strong local dimension in the current protest, which shouldn't be undermined, except being some current trend. But the issue are often very local, and definitely this is something that went very clear during the discussion. So I would like to thank you both. For me, it was very interesting, and I'm sure for all the audience it was. I mean, if we want to resume, I think one of the mistakes we often make is that when we see protests, we kind of focus on that and we think at one point it's finished. But overall, it's a trend. And if you see the history of Europe, for example, you see that some protests started, it went on for years, sometimes it reemerged, sometimes seems like things were not happening, but under the surface a lot was happening. So I think it's a very interesting time to look at that, and it would be really bad if we kind of lose the focus when a lot of things are happening that are not perhaps so evident, but they are happening in society, and there are also changes in society we tend to undermine while they are very important. They create the condition for people taking the streets. So thank you again. Thank you very much, Ms. Khatib, for her insightful analysis on Lebanon elsewhere in the region. The same goes with Mr. Al-Aldin. Thank you very much again. It was really great to have you both. And thank you again, because it was really, really, really interesting to hear your insight on the region. So now my colleague Beatrice will open a pool that we will use to improve our future meetings. So feel free to give us any suggestion you see now in the screen. And yeah, thank you very much, and hope to see you at MED eventually in autumn. But we will see each other online for sure. Thank you again.
Thank you. Thanks very much.